So it's been a few days since the Nintendo Switch OLED model announcement, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to digest this information and really think about it in some more detail. And this is a topic that I wanted to talk to you guys about because I think it's interesting, and hopefully this will give you a perspective of the OLED Switch model from the developer point of view. And for those people that don't know, I am a registered Nintendo developer. And I've already shipped 2 games on the Switch, which are Strife by Night Dive Studios and Shantae by WayForward and Limited Run. And I am working on more Switch games, and there are more Switch games to come. And I'm actively working on Switch dev hardware. So really, I just wanted to get those credentials out of the way before I start talking about things so you guys have a better understanding about my credentials and who I am. Now, with that said, I want to talk about the underlying issues that I have with the announcement of the OLED model. And I will first say that the announcement wasn't a big surprise. Many were speculating that there would be a new SoC-based chipset announcement that would come this year with 4K DLSS. And based on the developer angle that I just mentioned, I wasn't really so sure about that. It just didn't feel right to me. And if you've gone back and listened to my thoughts about the Switch Pro, I've always felt like something just fell off about the whole thing, because a new SoC at the end of the day means that code must be binary compatible with that new SoC, or it must be backward compatible. And with no SDK or information that third parties were given access to prepare themselves, I didn't really feel like that this report was accurate. And while I do think new hardware is coming, and I want to stress that, I just don't know the timing of that. It could be next year, it could be 2023. I just don't know. And I think anyone that you ask in the industry, or at least pretty much 99.9% other than Nintendo themselves and maybe some exclusive third parties, don't know the answer to that either. So going back to the OLED model, now I do love the hardware, but as a developer, unfortunately, it's a disappointment in many ways. At a minimum, I would have expected to see some improvements in areas that I would consider low-hanging fruit that wouldn't require a sweeping QA pass across the entire catalog of games to make sure that they didn't break. And I'm talking about increased memory and/or increased memory bandwidth. Now, right now, the Switch has 4 gigabytes of RAM on board, and only approximately 3.2 gigabytes of that is available to developers. Now, the remaining memory is used for the operating system and background tasks. Now, in 2017, 4 gigabytes of RAM was fine, but in 2021, it's really not going to cut it. Now, the push to increase RAM when the Switch came out was obvious, but let's kind of talk about that a little more in some detail. So, if you guys remember back in 2017 at GDC, Nintendo and Capcom were on stage together and they started talking about the Switch. Now, Capcom has played a vital role with the Switch hardware, and you may recall, or you may not, but I'll leave a link in the description below, that Capcom and other third parties pushed Nintendo to increase Switch RAM to 4 gigabytes. Now, they did this because Capcom felt confident that they wanted the Resident Evil RE engine to run inside of that space. And Nintendo were able to get the RAM up to 4 gigabytes. Now, imagine if those discussions didn't occur. We may have been left with a 2 gigabyte Switch model, or maybe something else. It's really hard to say. But there was a push to get that initial 4 gigabytes of memory on board the Switch hardware, which was the right move at the time. Now, for the most part, 4 gigabytes is perfectly acceptable. But I will say, when you're making exclusive Switch games, or if you're starting out the game's development cycle on the Switch hardware, or you're planning for the Switch, 4 gigabytes is totally fine. And for the most part, many of these games that you'll see on Nintendo Directs and whatnot usually are exclusive Switch games, and they play and look really well on the Switch. What I'm really concerned about are the ports to the Switch, and I want to talk about that in some more detail. So over the years, we've seen some really impressive ports come to the Switch, some of them that are labeled impossible ports, such as Doom Eternal, or Ori and the Will of the Wisps, or The Outer Worlds, to name a few. So let's talk about that a little bit. So The Outer Worlds released in 2019 in October, and appeared on the Switch in June of 2020. And remember, when that game came out, it was quite rough. It took many more months of polish for that game to work right, to look good, and to run at the level that Virtuos and Nintendo was probably expecting. Now, you may remember last year, Doom Eternal released for PC and consoles in March of 2020, and finally arrived on the Switch in December of that year. So a long, long time had passed, and we didn't hear much that had occurred during that time. Ori of the Will of the Wisps released in March of 2020 and released on the Switch in September of 2020. Now, if you take a look at the developer retrospectives of these games, they usually talk about memory limitations and how they can effectively make cuts to fit their game into that confined memory space.
As games have become more and more optimized for this previous gen, PS1, PS4, Xbox One, and now, of course, this next gen, there's a move in a new direction, a kind of a paradigm shift towards random access memory use versus pipelined memory. So, traditionally, you want all the data that the GPU is going to need to be loaded on the GPU before it tries to do anything, so that there's no memory stalls. Mm-hmm. And that's necessary because of how slow memory bandwidth used to be and how little GPU cache there was to work with. It was critical that that data be there in time.
And this is usually at the expense of things like textures. Texture sizes get reduced, also utilizing things like sprite atlases to, reduce on memory overheads as well. And in 2019, there's an article from Cuphead developers discussing how they optimized for the Nintendo Switch and the cuts and considerations that they needed to make. But if we're talking about impossible ports, we have to talk about The Witcher 3. Saber Interactive and CD Projekt Red did a masterful job on that port for the Switch. But if you take a look at the retrospective of that game, Saber and CD Projekt Red discussed that the original builds were using about 5 gigabytes of RAM, and during that 15-month of development was spent optimizing and squeezing down the memory overhead to make it all work. And look, the end result was impressive, but there was a lot of time and work that was put into this port. Now, all of these impossible ports are great handheld experiences for the Switch, but they all come at a cost. And back in 2017, up until now, I think many publishers were okay footing the bill for that. And in some cases, Nintendo themselves threw money into the ring, especially when we talk about The Witcher 3. But it's now 2021. We've got next-gen hardware. Unreal Engine 5 is being adapted in up-and-coming games. We've got techniques like ray tracing, HDR, DLSS, more complex systems, better cloth physics, shaders doing so much more. The Switch OLED model simply is going to get left behind. Now, we've already seen some studios decide to use cloud-based gaming on the Switch, and this is for the reasons exactly that I mentioned. Studios are going to become less and less interested in investing in the potential months or years of time to get their games running on the Switch. Now, the cloud is something that I think publishers are going to start leaning on more on the Nintendo Switch. Publishers want their games on the Switch because it makes them money, but many of them don't want to spend the millions investing in getting these ports up and running as impossible ports. The cloud is a cost-friendly equivalent for them, which at the end of the day offers the same or almost same gameplay experience. And with the Switch OLED model offering a wide Ethernet connection in the new Switch dock, I get the feeling that we're going to continue to see more cloud games to fill that void. Now, I also wanted to address a recent Digital Foundry Eurogamer article about a Switch dev kit that has 8 gigabytes of RAM on board. Now, some people are confusing this information with an unannounced retail Switch that will address the RAM concerns that I just mentioned, but unfortunately, this is not the case. If you look at any dev kit out there, going back years and years ago, they usually come with increased RAM to allow for profiling and debugging during game execution. And a great example of that would be the original Xbox XDK, which comes with 128 megabytes of RAM on board, or an Xbox 360 dev kit, which comes with 1 gigabytes. And we're usually talking about double the RAM of retail. And with the Switch, unfortunately, there's really nothing special to conclude from this information other than developers probably wanted more RAM in their dev kits to enable better debugging and profiling and allow those debugging tools to run concurrently with the game itself. Now, another area where I felt like Nintendo could have provided some games would be memory bandwidth. Unfortunately, the Tegra X1 memory bandwidth runs at 25.6 gigabytes per second, which is roughly that of the PlayStation 3. Age of Calamity on the Switch is a game that has been heavily criticized for its poor performance. Much of this has to do with the limitations around memory bandwidth, and that is the pipeline in how fast memory is read to or written to. And on the Switch, unfortunately, it's woefully slow, and this is probably due to maintain battery life, because I think battery life is the most important thing to Nintendo. But a boost in memory clocks or an improvement in bandwidth would provide immediate improvements to smooth out those frame rates. And we're not even talking about GPU or CPU clocks. I'm not even going there for this video, but the option to just increase memory bandwidth would really smooth out those hitches that we've seen in Link's Awakening, or those parts in Breath of the Wild that stutter or slow down, or, you know, when Age of Calamity has so much going on the screen that it literally drops to 15 frames per second. And I am a little bit perplexed, bemused that this did not happen with the OLED model. I would have liked to seen some iterative updates to the hardware, just some small tweaks here or there, nothing earth-shattering, but something that would have improved the overall user experience. Nintendo has to know this, and they must be concerned that their hardware hasn't changed since 2017, while the industry continues to move ahead. The budgets for games are only increasing. Next year, we're going to see Breath of the Wild 2 and Pokemon Arceus. Both of these games sound very large and very ambitious, and you do wonder what's left in the tank before the Switch needs some help. And I'm not talking about the cloud. I think the cloud will fill that gap for the time being, but I think the concept of impossible ports from the likes of Panic Button, will we continue to see those? I am not really so sure until we see something new coming out from Switch hardware. Now, Panic Button are the masters of extracting the very best from the hardware, but there's also a tipping point that will occur where the current hardware continues to be around, but the budgets don't make financial sense anymore, because there's just going to be so much time invested in trying to get these games running at a good level of performance, where the profit and loss margins, the overheads involved, just don't make sense. And I think that's really what Nintendo needs to be concerned about. So in conclusion, yes, I am a little disappointed at the Switch OLED model from a developer perspective, that it didn't offer anything new to developers to really sink their teeth into. And I think a lot of us would have really have liked to have seen that. But at the end of the day, I'm as much in the dark about what's next for Nintendo as what you guys are. But let me know what you thought about my thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Are you concerned about the future of the Switch? Do you think that Nintendo is thinking about new Switch hardware? Do you think that my concerns and reservations about up-and-coming Switch ports is warranted? Or do you think that Nintendo is just going to continue to do what they do, and that is not really listen to the concerns and thoughts of everyone else and just go ahead and continue to make awesome games? I think all those viewpoints are valid, but I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. So we're going to leave it here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.